Well, such an absolute joy to be with you, and thank you all for being here. Am I restricted to where I can run around? Yeah. So, that's okay. Great, thank you. Such beautiful words, Mary Ann sang at the end there, this precious spirit of truth. I'm so glad that truth is not just statements, it's not just concepts, it's not just ideas. Truth is a dynamic movement. It's a relationship. And so my desire really for these sessions is that we'll go beyond just ideas. Ideas are wonderful and they're going to be part of what we discuss, but something is happening that is more substantial than just the intellectual working that's going to take place. Because what we're trying to point towards is a reality that doesn't fit into language. Is a relationship that is so huge, so deep, so overwhelming that we continue to stutter and try and find words to point towards this reality that is more real than any concept that we've ever had. How many of you have discovered that sometime in your life that your concepts of God and God Himself are not the same thing? And was that a terrible or a wonderful discovery, or both? Both. Because I think for many years you go about having a relationship with your concept of God, being intimate with your concept of God, and then God tries to make room for Himself in your experience of Him. And the only way for God to make room for Himself in your experience of Him is to start breaking down your concepts of God. And ironically, it's often the things that we know about God for certain that keeps us from experiencing God in a new way. So I love the way in which God introduces some divine doubt into our experience of Him. That those questions that starts chipping away at the things that we're so certain about. And in the beginning, because we confuse our concepts of God with God Himself, that's a terrifying experience, because we kind of think that, am I starting to lose faith in God? And God's just saying, relax. I'm not nervous. Do you know God's not nervous of what you believe? Your beliefs aren't bringing about the insecurity within God. He's patiently just waiting to make Himself known to you in a way that's going to take you way beyond those restrictive ideas and concepts to an experience of God that for the rest of your life you're going to struggle to find words. If you found the words that accurately captures this beauty, you can be assured that you're not busy with God Himself. Beauty and the awesomeness of what God wants to reveal is something that is always overwhelming. It always decenters us. It always astonishes us. John 5 verse 20, Jesus says the Father loves the Son and He shows Him all things, and He will show even greater things than these, so that you may be astonished. the end goal of this revelation is not people who are right. The end goal of this gospel is not to produce people who are certain. The end goal is to produce a people who are astonished. See, even the New Testament church was birthed not as a community who found the answer to all your questions. So I was taught Jesus is the answer to all my questions. And the more I got to know Jesus, the more I realized that he's more interested in questioning all my answers than in answering all my questions. I mean, all my answers started to wobble, started to become more and more uncertain with this Jesus that for every answer I had just said, really? Is that the limits of your imagination? So the beauty of this truth is designed to, is meant to destabilize you. It's meant to make you fall in love. There's a reason why it's called falling in love. Because in that moment of falling in love, you're not as centered as you used to be. Remember when Rebecca sees Isaac? Rebecca is this biblical character that is a very strong individual. I mean, she tells her family, I will go and find and go meet this husband. She's very self-assured, but when she sees Isaac, she falls off her horse, covers her face. There's something in this encounter which decenters, destabilizes us, makes us astonished once again. So I want to look a little bit at the beauty of this astonishment, and I'm gonna maybe use a few metaphors to bring about contrast so that we can see more clearly towards what this concept is pointing. So the first thing I've tried to say now is that astonishment and certainty is not the same experience. Would you agree? Yes. You cannot be astonished and certain at the same time. Astonishment is being confronted with something that is larger than your frame of reference. It's larger than your framework of interpretation. It's an encounter that doesn't fit into your story, into your logic. That's why it is astonishing. Now, why is it so difficult to once again embrace astonishment instead of certainty? I think from a very early age, there's a period during which, and it's natural and it's good, where we search for certainty, because certainty promises security. And when we move from childhood imaginative, kind of more unconscious world in which everything can take on new meaning, and it's a world full of wonder, there comes a stage where the child is confronted with the fact that you have to understand this world the way it is, not just according to your fantasies and imagination. And so we start constructing an understanding and a framework of interpretation that can give us a better security as to the next step we take. Very early on, we realize that reality is not just something static. It moves from the past into the future. Now, that capacity that is unique to human consciousness to construct a story that comes from the past and moves into the future, that has a lot of benefits. We now learn that if we do certain actions, there are certain consequences, and we project that forward. If I want a more favorable future, how do I act now to bring about that future? And very soon, every time we take a step and the story unfolds the way we imagined it would, we become more assured of our story. We become more certain. And as I say, that's a necessary and good process of growing up. But what happens often is we become so obsessed with the security that certainty has to offer that we no longer leave room for the astonishment and the wonder, and we begin to suppress that creative, unconscious, that imaginative, creative part of us. And eventually, maybe certainty does deliver on its promise to give us security, because a prison is very secure. And we find ourselves very certain about who we are, very certain about who God is, within our very secure little prison. And the moment you are absolutely certain about who you are and who God is also the moment in which you become absolutely boring. And life becomes absolutely boring. It's very secure, but there's nothing new. There's no astonishment. And it is in that context that faith and doubt begins to work together to open up a world that is much larger than that prison. As you see, the opposite of faith in this context is not doubt. The opposite of faith might well be certainty. And when we find ourselves within these very secure prison walls of I know exactly how I define my faith, my beliefs, then how faith and doubt begins to work together is doubt begins to break down these prison walls so that faith can reach beyond the certainties and take hold of possibilities that you have not considered before. So when Jesus introduces us to his Father, he doesn't introduce us to the God for whom all things are certain. He introduces us to the God for whom all things are possible. See, possibility can never be reduced to certainty. If something is possible, it's not certain. And if something's certain, it's no longer possible. That's just, if language means anything, possibility and certainty are mutually exclusive. If it's certain, it's no longer possible. If it's possible, it's not certain. In our insecurity, we've imagined a God of absolute certainty, because we know that, there's times that I don't know exactly what's happening, but I really do hope God knows. And so we imagine a God of absolute certainty, but Jesus introduces us to the God of possibility. Can you imagine a God for whom all things aren't certain, but possible? Oh. I'm so glad that when Jesus came, he didn't just confirm everything we believed about God. I'm part reason why his message had such an impact and why he got crucified is he introduced us to some ideas about God that was very different from what we imagined. I mean, many of the people within his faith community kind of looked forward to the Messiah the way in which many of our Christian friends are looking forward to the second coming. We kind of just hope that eventually God's going to show up and show the world that we were right and they were wrong. And he's going to show it in the most convincing way possible. And so when Jesus first appeared, they were quite excited. He showed some potential. He was healing the sick and doing things that only if God was with him, this could happen. But then he started with all these irritating stories about people from another faith being the heroes of his story. How dare he tell a parable where the Muslim is the hero? I'm just putting it in our context today. How dare he tell a parable in which somebody from a different faith community emerges as the one who had the compassion? So he became unpopular very soon because he wasn't the kind of Messiah that just came and put his hand around their shoulders and said, I'm bringing you the revelation, and this is what we hope revelation would be, the revelation that you've always been right. And I'm just coming to reveal the depth of your rightness. No, actually, I think it's Matthew, is it 11, 27, 27, somewhere there, he says, no one knows the Father. Hey guys, despite your thousands of years of Bible study, you've missed it. No one knows the Father except the Son. No one knows the Son except the Father. So he comes to introduce an experience of God which was in many ways very contrary to everything they thought before. But then, many of the things that they looked back at suddenly found new meaning. And so the prophets can say that, you know, he came to fulfill the scripture, but he fulfilled them in a very different way than what they imagined before. He doesn't just come to fulfill their desires, he comes to first transform their desires and then fulfill them. And so everywhere where we go, one of the most exciting things that I enjoy about settings like this is I know I'm going to say things with which you don't agree yet. But at the same time, I have this joyful expectation that there's something in the heart of man that just resonates with truth. No matter how contrary it is to my religious upbringing, to my tradition, and I can do it with the joyful expectation because it's been done to me. That God has revealed himself in ways that I think my whole foundation has just crumbled and it's gone. And then at the same time, I discover a God that's so much more beautiful, enticing, seducing, overwhelming than the little, boring, predictable God that I created within my certainty. Glory. So certainty and faith. Now it was Paul that was so absolutely convinced that these heretics needed to be corrected, that he jumped on his donkey with all the people that was given to him to go and find them, drag them to prison. He was certain in whom he believed. He was certain. And then suddenly a light shines. In 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6, he actually tells us the light shone out of darkness into our hearts. Now, the people around him said he was knocked off and the light shone on him, but Paul's own words is the light came from within. That this light shone within the darkness. The same God who said, let light shine, shone into my heart to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ Jesus. And it's in this moment in which Paul doubts everything that he knew about God. In which he says, who are you? In which he's no longer occupied with his answers. I know who God is and I know you wrong. But in this moment in which he says, who are you? That moment of doubt is also the moment of the most honest faith being birthed. I started off saying that the early church community wasn't a church that just had all the answers. You can read it in Acts 2. The church was actually born with people whose minds were alight with questions. Remember Acts 2? Fire come and sat upon their heads. And they ran into the street saying, what do these things mean? They didn't run into the street saying, we have all the answers. They ran into the street saying, we have more questions than what we've ever had. Because something astonishing, something that doesn't yet fit into our doctrines, something that doesn't yet fit into our framework of understanding has encountered us, has overwhelmed us. And this world is much more interested in people who are astonished than in people who know that they are right. Woo! He wants to astonish us. And so, certainty, truth. I want to use another metaphor that you might be familiar with if you come out of a Christian background. But have any of you heard about the idea that God has a plan for your life? Most of you do. Now, there's some things about it that's beautiful, and I'll hopefully get to it. But I also want to introduce another metaphor, and so that we can put these two into contrast with one another. Because what we often do is we just grab a hold of one metaphor because we want certainty, and then we push it to an extent where it wasn't meant to be pushed to. There is room for plans, but the way in which we've interpreted God as a plan for my life is like me looking at my 1-year-old son and saying, you are going to be, I don't know, what example, I always think of something that he's not. You're going to be a dentist. That's what you're going to be. And that's my plan for your life. And I'm going to buy you little children's books with teeth in. And we're going to introduce you to all our friends who are dentists. And, you know, that might be, if that's the career he chose, and for some people, that's beautiful. But can you see if I decided for this 1-year-old, that's my plan for your life, that's not going to be very conducive to a good relationship, no matter what it is. Even if I decided you're going to be an artist or you're going to be this or that, the fact that I want to impose a precise plan of where he needs to end up on just takes away the joy of having this new life, this story that can go anywhere. That's the beauty of having children, that there's this creative, chaotic, bubbling, and it's in the greatest chaos that the most interesting things happen. We've pushed the metaphor of God as a plan for our lives to that extent where your only contribution was find out what the plan is and get with it. Who of you have found the plan? And who of you have stuck to it? So I want to introduce another metaphor, and that's the metaphor of story. And to bring a little bit of contrast, the best plans have few surprises. The best stories have many surprises. Where if we go into a movie and in the first 5 minutes I can tell you who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, and how the whole thing's going to unfold, it's so boring. You can see the whole plot. But some of the most exciting movies are those that I wanted to walk out of after the first 5 or 10 minutes, decided I'll hold on, and then they frustrate me, and then they make me mad, and then at the end, even the beginning finds new meaning. Because it is full of twists and turns that I did not foresee. That's the most exciting stories. So plans try to limit the future to what is predictable, and it tries to even plan for the unpredictable. You know, we don't want to be surprised with plans. Stories unfold organically, naturally, full of surprises. Now, one of the problems with only relating with the plan metaphor to God is when, this is not the church, so kind of when the shit hits the fan. In the plan metaphor, what happens then is one of two things. The first thing is, what do we normally think? If we hit a disaster, a trauma, or something that is truly evil, and you only relate to God with the plan metaphor, what do we think? We messed up. I missed the plan. We kind of think that God has this plan, and the reason this nonsense happened is because I'm out of the plan. Can you see that creates a sense of distance? Very often it goes about with other metaphors of God as He'll protect you within this road, but boy, do you step out, He's just going to let things happen to you. That kind of idea. The other way in which we respond if we believe that everything's planned, and I've met people that sincerely finds some kind of condolence in the fact that everything is God's plan. Even the most evil things that you can imagine happening to you. In that plan metaphor, but what we secretly think very often is, my goodness, surely God could make a better plan than this. If this is the plan, He needs some help. There's many people I think can make better plans than this. Now, we don't say that out loud, so this is the only time you'll hear it. We kind of just process it internally. But how do you reconcile the horror and the evil of something that happens that's so contrary to everything that we call love and good, and still imagine that it's part of a plan? So let's leave. So that is one of the weaknesses of only relating to God in terms of a plan. Which, can you see how that goes along with the certainty? At least God knows. And let me introduce the metaphor of story. The story, when you hit that same disaster, when you hit that same tragedy, in the story metaphor, it doesn't have to create a sense of distance, because every story has a chapter that ends in tragedy, but it's not the end of the story. Every story has a chapter that confuses you, that changes everything upside down, and you don't know who the people are you deal with. They acted so contrary. Everything is confusing, but it's not the end of the story. You see, when we relate to God in the story metaphor, we can start developing a sense of what is meant by incarnation, by a God who steps into our flesh, a God who becomes human, who wants to be embodied in this life, who wants to journey with you through this story, a God who would rather go to hell than abandon you. If there's anything that Jesus demonstrates, it's a God that says, I will go into the depths of your alienation, the depths of your confusion, the depths of your alienation. I will hang out in your pain with you, but I will never leave you nor forsake you. That's a very different God. So let me try and put this together in another way. We're just using different metaphors because we're trying to point towards this reality that's larger than any one metaphor. You understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying it's just this or this. It's kind of a beautiful flow of these things. Now, in my upbringing, and I think many of you can relate to the idea of a God who had this plan, had this purpose for your life, standing behind you and trying to keep you in the parameters in which this plan will still work. A God who's either behind us or a God who's above us, trying to impose his design, impose his creation. We're talking about unleashing the Creator. And so the first concept that had to change for me is this concept that creation happened in the past. And not just creation, but the plan. We had this idea of a God who, way back in the past, had the design, had the blueprint, had the purpose, and now he basically tries to keep us within the parameters and impose the plan upon us. So let me flip that around with the story metaphor. What if God does not stand behind us with a plan? Can you for a moment, I know it might be offensive to a part of your mind, but try this. For a moment, imagine a God that doesn't have a plan. Okay, we'll get back to the plan. There's some good things about plan. But let's first break it down to the basics. What if God does not stand behind us with a plan, with a certain direction, a certain way of fulfilling it? But what if God is the possibility of all things, standing in front of us with possibilities? And whatever possibility you choose to realize, he'll just open up more possibilities. Even if you step in the totally wrong direction, he's right there, opening up new possibilities. Certainly, God knows where he wants to take us. There's a goal. Jesus speaks about this goal, that we may all be one, that we might experience this union, this love. John 17, it's between verse 20 and 25. Father, I pray that they may be with me where I am, that they may see the love with which you loved me before the world began. Before any of this, what was the motivation for God to create? Was God just bored? Was he just this God of which continually, in his artistic, creative capacity, imagines new ways of being himself? Did he just think, what kind of creatures can I bring into existence that will irritate me for all eternity. and here you are. No. or was he just a kind of angry old judge in an empty courtroom, seeking some victims? Here you are. Or was this God that Jesus speaks of, who was in the process of loving, this movement of relationship, this God of possibility, who continually imagines new ways of being himself? Imagined you. Imagined you as one of the ways in which he could embody himself. In a way that is irrepeatable. A way that is irreplaceable. In you, God has a personality he has nowhere else. In you, God has relationships he has nowhere else. This God is not standing behind us, trying to enforce his vision on some very stubborn, irritating creatures, but rather a God who continually stands in front of us saying, what I demonstrated in the incarnation is that my desire is to become human. This is a very different God than the first story we told about God. You see, human version 1, Genesis 2 and 3, was a human with such a sense of insecurity that he continually grasped for any promise that will make him more like God. It's a human with a sense of lack of being. A human who wants to become more godlike. The human story retold in Jesus, human version 2, this is what Paul speaks about when he says the second Adam, or the last Adam, is the story completely inversed, because in Jesus we meet a God who so adores human existence that he pours himself out. He empties himself into human form. And Jesus does not grasp after equality with God. Can you see it's the exact inverse of Genesis 3? I must say this a few times over because I'm also still grasping it. Genesis 3, a human with such a sense of inadequacy and lack. And this is not just the historic story. This is the story of every human being. In every person growing up, there's a whispering voice that says, you lack being. You are not what you should be. And then all the fruit is held before us. If you can only achieve, if you can only become, if you can only have this, you will feel fulfilled. That's human version 1. And so we continually try to prop our sense of being by grasping after stuff, after achievement, after becoming. And even in those few individuals who are successful in attaining what they set out to attain, very often feels a very deep, deep-seated sense of lack. Because what promised to fulfill just left them with the realization that they are more empty than what they ever imagined, that it did not fulfill. Human version 2. The human story retold in Jesus tells the story of a God who doesn't demand that we should become like him in the first instance, but a God who says there is something of such value and beauty in your ordinary fleshly existence that I'll pour myself out into you. Instead of a human trying to become like God, we have a God becoming human in Jesus. A God that cannot give any greater validation or justification to your existence than saying, you are what I wanted to become. Woo!